Thank you for getting round to this night, as Sir Lancelot may have said to Guinevere. Mr. Bailey, I'm delighted to join in this important debate this morning. I hope it's not the last we are going to have on this subject, and I do not seek to replicate much of what my right honourable and honourable friends have already said. But I just want to pick up on one or two issues. The first one is our physical global imprint, and that is our estate. I'm going from here, hopefully later today, to lunch to congratulate James Sturton and Luke White, who have produced a magnificent book called British Embassies, Their Diplomatic Architecture and History, which is an extraordinarily good book on Britain's overseas estate. And when you look through that book, you can have one of two reactions. You can either giggle in bemused embarrassment about the awful post-colonial life that our embassies represent, or you can be rather proud that we possess some of the finest properties, many of which were gifted to us, incidentally, by the then heads of state in those host countries, and it is something that other countries look upon with envy. And in my 4.5 years at the Foreign Office, I was pleased to open some rather small embassies that are being closed in Asuncion, in El Salvador, in consulates in Recife, and so forth. And it was always a source of pride to be reopening embassies, however small, rather than going round and closing them. But I cannot think of a single example in retrospect when we can stand up and say, gosh, weren't we clever to have sold X embassy? We're in much better accommodation, Madrid being one of the great disasters. I was rather involved in the Bangkok embassy site. Again, I think there were reasons why it was inappropriately located and no longer fit for purpose, although, needless to say, we just spent some huge amount of money on accommodation on that site. But I now note with horror, I pick up on my various visits at the Chancellery building, which will be well known to my right honourable friend, the member for Mid-Sussex, whose bedroom no doubt overlooked it for many happy years in Paris, is possibly going to be sold. What a ridiculous message to send to Paris at the heart of Europe as we exit the EU, than to sell our Chancellery building on the Faubourg Saint-Honoré. Now, my right honourable friend, the Minister, who does an excellent job in the Foreign Office now, I don't know whether he sits on the body I sat on, which is the Commission or the board, the Foreign Office board, where many of these things are discussed. But it strikes me, in my experience, that these things are never really brought to the attention of ministers, perhaps the Foreign Secretary. But on the whole, they're decided by the Permanent Foreign Secretary and others, the mandarins within the Foreign Office. And there is absolutely no doubt, to my way of thinking, that these are Treasury-led decisions. This is about saving money. This is not about looking at our global footprint and where we want to be represented. And I do think that in future, whenever there is any discussion, and not at the 11th hour when these decisions have effectively been already taken, that there is a role here, an oversight role for the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, on which many honourable gentlemen sit, to actually have a view on any proposed changes to the diplomatic estate globally. I would like to see that change, and I would welcome the Minister's view on that. First of all, I take the honourable gentleman, and then I'll take the right honourable gentleman.
Well, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee is intending to do exactly that. I just correct one thing. I don't think the Madrid decision was made on a Treasury basis. The old building was a very difficult building to maintain and listed under Spanish law and all the rest of it, but we did move to the wrong place. I opened it as it happened. The highest embassy I think we've got in the world, because it's in the highest capital in Europe and on like the 75th floor or whatever, virtually inaccessible to lots of people. A terrible mistake to have for us to have moved there. But my biggest concern is...
Interventions should be short and not speeches. Can I make the point that I want to bring the front bench spokespersons in at 10:30, so would everybody bear that in mind?
I'll take my right on.
So Hugo Swire.
Intervention.
Very briefly, I was in Panama just after we had sold...
Richard Benyon.
really one of the few nice buildings in Panama City on the main Corniche and moved the embassy residence to the suburbs. And the ambassador said to me, almost with tears in his eyes, that he could have made a business case for the use of that building, which would have allowed us to continue there. Does my right honourable friend agree that very often it is a short-term decision that not only fails to understand the long-term business case, but doesn't understand the influence case either?
Indeed, my right honourable friend is clearly right, and I see that on the 21st of February, in a topical question, I actually asked that there should be a moratorium on any asset disposals until such a review is complete, which was a question which was answered with tremendous agreement by the Foreign Secretary. So let's have a moratorium until we decide what our global footprint is going to be, and let's have no more selling off of properties until the Foreign Affairs Select Committee has some formal oversight role. The other thing, which was touched on briefly by my right honourable friend, the member for Mid-Sussex, in terms of his experiences in Zimbabwe, is another thing I campaigned, and I'd be interested for the Minister to update us on this, which is what I called 1HMG. What's happened over the years is that many different government departments have crept into some of these places and have other organisations in many capitals around the world, the Scottish office, DEFRA, DEC, all these other departments have people there. And very often the ambassador doesn't really have much control over some of these other organisations. In some countries, I think Nepal was one, the head of DFID was a much more senior figure than our ambassador and wouldn't kowtow to the ambassador. Now, it's my view, very simply, that the person who represents, the individual who represents the British government abroad is the ambassador. And everybody should work for the ambassador. There shouldn't be a discrepancy in terms of employment, in accommodation and so forth, and where possible, all these other agencies should be brought under the British Embassy or the British High Commission and co-located on that estate. Which leads you to my next question, my next point really, which is we are still shadow-boxing about the independence of the Department for International Development. And increasingly, as a lot of the Foreign Office is funded by overseas development money, that skewers things and the whole lines are getting blurred. I wish at some point someone would have the bravery to say that DFID belongs back with the mothership. We could have a huge economy of savings, a greater alignment of British views and British values overseas by bringing it back to the mothership. And anyone who says we can't do that, all the NGOs will get too upset. Well, I don't think the NGOs at the moment are in any position to do anything, at least some of them. And the stock answer, rejoinder to them is, look, we stand by our pledge of 0.7% of GDP. That's our answer. How we actually apply that is up to the government, not up to the NGOs. Mr. Bailey, very quickly, we are about to see a major change. The European External Action Service, the force under Federica Mogherini, I always thought to be pretty hit and miss around the world. It seemed to me very often the head of the EAS was always going off to the British Embassy to find out the latest intelligence, but we paid a lot of money to them. A lot of our best people were employed there on better terms than our own people locally. That's something we want to withdraw, and I'd be interested by the Minister's views on how many people who work currently for the EAS, British people, are going to be pulled back into the FCO and where they're going to be deployed. But overall, it seems to me that a major piece of work needs to be done. A major realignment of what the UK is seeking to do abroad. And that does involve the World Service, it does involve, of course, the British Council, it does involve different departments of state, it does involve redefining what we mean by soft power, as well as ensuring that that soft power is backed up by a sufficient military capability. There's no point having soft power unless you have a decent armed forces, which, if necessary, can support that soft power. This is a fundamental piece of work that needs to be done, and I am not convinced that it is being done cross-departmentally. I'm not convinced it's being done by ministers, and I believe a cabinet subcommittee should be set up without further ado to bring together all these competing demands on the Exchequer to articulate what it is we expect from our superb diplomatic service, the envy of the world, to make sure that they are given the tools to do the job and that we better coordinate all the different parts of the state to that end.